So here we're going to look at how to create a typical Ayrshire style needle lace filling. This is in a really large eyelet, and I would suggest that this is going to be worked with number 12 perlé thread. Working it in a large eyelet and a heavier thread is a really good way to get used to the technique and the pattern and understand how to work the stitches before you then go to the finer scale. So this eyelet is about 3 centimeters across. I've worked that in number 12 perlé as well with a running stitch edge, then double running stitch, making a hole in the centre, cutting out to the double running stitch edges, folding the flaps of linen under, and then binding the edge thoroughly round, and then cutting the excess flaps away on the reverse. The first thing I'm going to do is use a template. So this is a template I've created using a circle which I got from the computer. So you can find a circle that's divided into 5 equal portions, and then I've printed that onto card and just cut out the middle. I used a hole punch for that, but you can just cut out with scissors if you prefer. It just means that you haven't got to mark the equal proportions of your pattern onto the circle in any way, and you can find patterns like that on the computer easily for circles divided into various different numbers. So that's really helpful. If you haven't got access to that, you could also just create one using a protractor. The first thing I'm going to do with that is use a little bit of tacking thread and just tack the pattern into place so that it's not going to shift around. Notice that I've got a little bit of space between the edge of the eyelet and the pattern. That's just so that we can stitch comfortably between there later on. So these are just big tacking stitches worked into the card. Paper would be fine as well, just to hold that steady while we work. And you could do exactly the same for the patterns that you work in the small eyelets on a true Ayrshire piece of embroidery. It's worth creating a set of templates with different numbers of proportions, so say halves and quarters and fifths and sixths and sevenths. I wouldn't go to many more than that, because usually you can judge further divisions by eye, and having too many marks around a circle can just be confusing. So we're going to work a couple of stitches just to tack that off and secure that and stop it moving any further. And there we go. We're then going to take, I've got a 24 chenille needle with a nice long length of number 12 perlé in there. I've got 1.2 meters. It's quite difficult to judge the exact amount needed for a big eyelet like this, but I'm also going to, in this design, show you how to join a thread in if it breaks. That's not possible in some Ayrshire fillings, but in this filling it is, and so it's quite useful to know. It's worth, when you take that off the reel of perlé, just stretching it between your fingers of one hand and your fingers of the other, and just twanging the thread a couple of times. That helps to relax the thread and stop it twizzling. So we're going to tie a knot in the other end, and I'm going to place my knot well away from the design over here, so it's not in the way while I work. If you were an actual project, it's worth placing that knot on a design line or within a design area, just so you're not marking the potentially quite delicate fabric surrounding your design. So place the knot over here, and then we're going to come up just slightly to the right of the first marker here. I'm going to cast the thread on by stabbing into the edge of my eyelet, so pushing between the overcasting stitches of the eyelet. Now these may show a little bit in 12 perlé, they disappear fairly well, but they can show a tiny bit. But usually in Ayrshire work you're using a very fine lace thread, and the edge of your eyelet will have been worked with a cotton floche or something like that, and therefore these stitches will disappear in very, very nicely. They just want to always point inward so that they slip between the stitches which are overcasting your eyelet. So we begin by coming up on the first mark on the outside edge of your eyelet. It's important that your needle begins in that position. Lay your thread across the eyelet, and it's very important at all times that you keep your working threads really organised. Now we're going to work a group of 5 stitches here, reasonably close together, to make a cluster of 5. Very important to remember that the first thread of that group of 5, this first thread emerging on the outside edge of your eyelet becomes your first stitch. It's not going to have anything else done to it, but already just by coming up through the fabric, it is a stitch in its own right. So always remember that. Stitch number 2, we're going to place reasonably close together. I've got probably about 1 millimetre between the two, and notice the needle is immediately going back down on the outside edge of the eyelet. So it came up on the outside edge and it's going back down on the outside edge. We're going to drop the needle through the fabric and immediately, using the eye of the needle, bring it up to the left-hand side. Now, as a useful thing to remember here, we're working clockwise around the eyelet, and we've got a single thread, which we're going to call number 1. We've got a double thread, which we're going to call number 2, and we've got a double thread in the needle, which we're going to call number 3. These threads should always be in this order each time you work a stitch. Totally ignore the thread which emerged from your very starting point there. Just leave that to the side and leave it laying across the eyelet. So you've got 1, 2 and 3. The needle is in front of the 2 threads. We're going to pick up the thread and we're going to twist it once, and then we're going to twist it twice around the needle. We're going to grab the needle by the eye and we're going to pull it through, pulling towards the center of the eyelet. So keep pulling through and always keep pulling towards the center. Use your needle as a tensioner and ease it back, just easing it back until you can feel some tension on the twists there. You hit a point where you feel like you're going to have to tug hard to make that any tighter. We're then going to work stitch number 3. So you can see we've got 2 stitches there. One which is a little bit floppy and moving around, and that's stitch number 1. It will always look a little bit peculiar that until later. And then we've got stitch number 2. This is a twisted buttonhole with 2 twists. Okay. We're then going to work stitch number 3. So we take the needle again from the top down, straight down through the fabric with a punching action, and then straight back up again. Notice there's tension here. I haven't pulled the needle a long way down behind the design. It's just a tiny bit, just about 1 centimetre of thread is coming up into the eyelet hole, and we're in control the whole time. So we have now got our 1, 2, 3. 1 single thread, 2 double thread, 3 is the double thread in the needle. 1, 2, 3, going clockwise around the circle. Take your double thread and we're going to twizzle it anti-clockwise around the needle once, so you can see the 1 twist on the needle there, and then we're going to twist it round a second time. So you'll be able to see you've got 2 twists cleanly on the needle there. There is no need to be pulling these really tight. That makes the whole process difficult. Make sure you've got plenty of needle emerging out through above the eyelet hole here. Don't have the needle low down because that means those twists are going to fall off easily. So plenty of needle sticking up. Just let that thread settle and avoid it popping off the top, and grab the needle. Notice I'm holding nothing other than the needle at that point. I'm not holding the twists. If we do that, those will be tight and it will be hard to pull the needle through. Pull the needle towards the center of the eyelet and keep pulling towards the center of the eyelet. Again, use that needle to organize the thread. That's even more important when you're using the fine threads, and slide that needle back towards the edge until you feel that resistance. Have a little check that you've therefore got 3 stitches, a single untwisted stitch and 2 double twisted buttonholes. You're then going to take the needle down a 4th time, so take it down again. Keep this single thread organized, laying across the hole. Don't let it fall out of the way, don't let all these threads get in the way. Keep it laying cleanly across there. Drop it down, bring it up in front, clockwise direction, 1, 2, 3. Take it round once, take it round twice, grab the needle just by the needle, don't hold the twist, don't hold the thread, and don't let them be tight, and you're going to ease that through. It's always difficult at the beginning when your thread is much longer than it would normally be. So we've got 4 now. We're then going to work stitch number 5, so drop down again, organise your threads, lay the single across the hole, punch down, bring it up in front, 1, 2, 3. That rule is useful because it's very common for people to suddenly do this and have the needle in the middle of the 2 threads and then twist the other way. So by keeping to that rule of 1, 2, 3, they're always in the right order, and automatically, this is for a right-hander, by the way, because you may want to go in the opposite direction if you're a left-hander. You pick up the thread and you wrap anti-clockwise once and anti-clockwise twice. Check for those 2 twists on the needle, and then grab the eye of the needle and pull through. And pull through towards the centre of your eyelet. It's important to pull to the centre. If you pull to the side or back, you'll distort your stitches and you won't encourage those twists to slide up and tension appropriately. So pull that back, feel the resistance. You see how they're curling? That will always happen at this stage. Get your needle in and tension them out again. We're then going to leave a large space and move to our next dot in the group of 5. And we're going to work 5 stitches there. So we drop down again with stitch number 1 of this group on the first dot. It's very easy as you begin to work around the circle that your threads become disorganized. So we're going to be really careful to keep those organized. Keep that single thread laying across the eyelet hole. Drop down, come up in front again, clockwise direction, 1, 2 and 3 in front. Pick up the double thread, twist around once, twist around twice, grab the needle and pull through. And again, pull towards the centre. So even though you're moving around the circle, don't change where you're pulling. Pull to the imaginary centre of that eyelet and ease that back. Okay, so we need 4 more of those. So we're going to work another one. So in front, 1, 2, 3, once and twice, grab the needle and pull through to centre. Use the needle to tension. Look at the tension of your previous group and aim to get these similar spacing and similar tension approximately. Drop down, come up in front, once and twice and grab the needle and pull through. It can be very hard when you're beginning to learn these to get the tension exactly right as well as the pattern of stitching right first time. And that's why it's really worthwhile to create one of these practice eyelets and have a go at the pattern that you're intending to work on a large scale first, because then you've got the pattern in your head before you start battling with the finer thread or trying to get the tension right. Slide back and there you've got your group of 5 again. So we then move around the circle again to dot number 3. And again, it's easy for this to happen, for the threads to cross over each other and start getting confused which bit to pick up. If you're on a hoop that can be turned, you can turn the hoop so that the group of stitches you're working is always facing you. That can be less confusing. But often for this, you may be in a static hoop that you can't turn, and it's useful to know how to turn your hands and your brain a little bit so that you can just continue to work round as normal. So we take the needle down, always down on the first dot, organise your threads again. You've got your single thread, your double thread, and the needles in front. We pick up the double thread and we twist anti-clockwise once and twice. Look for those 2 twists on the needle, grab the needle and pull to centre and use the needle to tension. So 4 more of those here. Keep the threads organised, 1, 2 and 3 in front. Once and twice, grab the needle and pull through. Down again. Up in front, once, twice, grab the needle and pull through. And down again. Up in front. You see how easy it is for those threads to cross over? And we could be picking this one up to twist with. And that's a common problem. Leave that one out of the way. Pick up the double, once, twice, and pull through. Notice that my needle never drops all the way below the frame like we normally do when we're stitching. It's always in this small area of movement here, which means we've got control of it the whole time. Drop down, straight back up, once, twice, pull through to centre. Check your number, we've got 5 there, and then we're going to move to the next group. Organise again, single out of the way, drop down, come up in front, 1, 2, 3, anti-clockwise once and twice, grab the eye of the needle and pull through. And then 4 more. Drop down, come up in front once and twice and pull through. And again, up, once, twice, pull through. once and twice, and pull through. All Ayrshire patterns, of which there are many, are created simply by changing the spacing and pattern of your stitches around these rings. If you imagine how many different patterns you could create on that first ring of the design simply by changing the number you put into the groups, the number of groups, the spacing in the groups themselves, the spacings between the groups, myriad possibilities, and that's the only thing that creates different designs. There are a few other little elements that you can add in along the way, but very, very few. And so this is lovely to experiment with. Just having a little sampler of various different sizes of eyelets and having a go at creating your patterns. The pattern will also look very different depending what size of eyelet you work it in. So if we work this pattern in a much smaller eyelet, it would look very, very different. And patterns can be created just by that variation of what you're putting within the size of hole you're creating. Threads can move and be tensioned in different ways, and they will look very different and look as though you've created whole new patterns. So we drop down on dot number 5 now, drop down, come up in front again, 1, 2, 3, round twice and pull through to center. And then down again, once and twice and pull through to center. And down again, come up once, twice and pull through to center. And there we are, there's our first row. Don't be worried if you get little bits of tangling happening, it's a common problem in fillings. Just get your needle in that loop and pull through. It's just an issue of having a long thread, and generally they just ease out very happily. So there we've got 5 groups of 5 stitches. Only the first group is different in that initial starting thread remains as a piece of thread with no twist on it, but you can still see there's a group of 5 if we stretch it out there. So the next stage is to link this circle together. This is really easy. We're going to pick up that space between stitch 1 and 2, the untwisted and the twisted, and we're just going to drop down into it. Again, we're not going to pull the needle all the way through to the back. Instead, we're just going to bring it up in the center and bring it through and connect. So it's just simply a slip through and pull up. We're then going to repeat that process between every pair of stitches. So we drop down and we come up in the middle. And notice that each time I do that, I'm pulling in a clockwise direction. So I drop down, come up in the middle, use the eye so that it's a nice punch down, punch up action, much smoother, and pull to the left in that clockwise direction. This is stretching the stitches out and creating that nice tension along those bars. Dropping down, coming up, and pull through. The long bars, of course, one twist isn't going to do very much there, so we're going to do 2. We drop down and come up, drop down and come up. And if your bar was longer, you could do 3 or 4 in there. The number doesn't matter, the number is required to create a nice tension across the bar. And we're going to continue around the circle in that manner. It's very important that you pull every twist that you do, so that you're pulling up that tension the whole time. Don't try and work 3 twists and then pull the tension out, because it just won't work. So 2 in the long space. Be careful that you don't bring your needle up through the working loop. Again, a common problem, because that will form a buttonhole knot and you'll have a static point in your filling. You won't be able to pull up the tension in that area. And you should be able to see now how those stitches are stretching out and being drawn in towards center. Also, the tension on the stitches is increasing. We've got that nice rigid feel to that. I'm not pulling really, really hard. In the finer thread, if you pull too hard, you can break it easily, of course. So it's a firm, even tension, not pulling the thread really, really tough. And again, as we come round each one, we're pulling up and 2 in the bar, continually pulling with the circle, with that clockwise direction. And then we're back to the last remaining bar. You can always remember where your start point is because of that single untwisted thread, so that's a good reference point. It's easy to see in the large fillings, but it can get harder to see in the finer ones. So also you could mark that on your pattern. That's quite useful as a memory device. So we're now going to do just one twist into this one, because our next row of pattern, we want to emerge from the center of this bar. So it makes sense to just do 1 to take us to the middle rather than our usual 2, which would take us right over to here. Again, those numbers are adjustable depending on the pattern you're doing. Now, going back to the very beginning, we talked about the fact that the initial starting thread emerging from the side of the eyelet is the first stitch of your row, and the same is true on this row. So this thread emerging from the bar here is already a stitch. We're going to work 1 stitch in each of the large spaces on this row, just 1, and therefore this needs no more emerging from this large space. So we're going to go back to twisted buttonholes, and our first stitch is going to be in this large space here, because we've already got that one there. So easy to forget that and work your first stitch here, but we definitely want it there. So again, organise your thread, single thread laying over the hole, needle punching down and coming up clockwise in front of the working thread, 1, 2 and 3. Pick up 2 and twist around once and twice, grab the eye of the needle and pull through to centre. So it's just the same as it was when you worked the first row. Tension here is a little bit harder. It can be harder to judge how tight to pull it, and again part of that is practice, but we're looking for it to just be slightly short of the very, very centre as a good guide. Drop down, organise your threads. We've got the single out of the way, drop down, come up in front, once and twice, grab the needle and pull through. Adjust that tension. So you can see we're starting to create a little bit of space in the middle, which you'll see why that's important in a moment. Up to the top, straight away, organise the threads, 1, 2 and 3 in front. Once and twice, grab the needle and pull through. And then over to the side, organise your threads, 1, 2 and 3, once and twice, and grab the needle and pull through. Again, we're going to connect the circle together, and it's exactly the same process as the previous row. So we're going to drop in this space between stitch 1 and 2. Just a point to note here as well, it can again be very, very easy, a really common problem for people to go and work another stitch here. And because this stitch looks really peculiar, it looks like it's pulled across at a strange angle. But you need to remember when you pull that in like so, that's creating that shape. And that bit of thread is your first stitch. So don't be tempted to do another one to here because it will look even more peculiar. So to link the circle, we're going to drop the needle between stitch 1 and 2. So stitch 1 is the untwisted one and stitch 2 is the first twisted bar. Drop down and straight back up in the center using the eye of your needle. Drop down and straight back up. And drop down and straight back up. Again, remember every stitch you do, pull with the circle clockwise, and you can see it's starting to pull up that slack in the middle. Pull, pull, pull. You can see that closing in and it's starting to look a better shape. See, it springs back a little bit when I let go and come up again and wiggle that up. A little bit of wiggling with thread is always a good way to tension rather than just tugging. Because you can see that expanding when I let go a little bit, it can be helpful to go round again. So space number 1, and back up in the center, give it another little gentle tug, a little bit of a wiggle, and you're going to work round again and put 1 stitch into each space. Like so, and we're back to the beginning again. And again, you can tell the beginning because you've got your single untwisted and slightly odd looking bar there. You could now complete this filling and work your way back out to the outside. But we're going to add what's called a buttonhole pop in the centre, an extra little embellishment, and this can be a really good way of enabling you to start a new thread in the middle of a filling if you're starting to run out, or your thread's getting worn and fluffy, or you're worried that it's going to break at some point. So to do this, we're going to drop down into this space to the right of the untwisted bar and come up below it. This is just to get us started, and that sits nice and flat then. We're then going to weave around the circle. Now this we can do a few stitches at a time because they will pull up quite happily. So we're going to weave over, under, and this is why I've deliberately worked this filling with an odd number of bars so that we can get a perfect weave in the centre. If you had an even number of bars, you would be perfectly fine to work this filling as well, but you would just occasionally slip under 2 so you can offset the weave. Now we're going to weave round here about 15 times. I say about because I've lost count already. And I'd also like to show you how we can cast on a new thread. So we're going to do that now, and this is a really good time. This is basically the padding for the buttonhole wheel. And therefore, if we join the thread into the padding, it's going to be completely invisible in the finished effect. So we're literally going to just take that thread that we're getting rid of and park it over at the side here. I'm just going to catch it into the linen and leave it there. So I've not stitched it at all, I've just did a little catch into the fabric so it's still loose and we could still move it if we wanted to. So that's leaving that one to the side. And then we're going to take our next thread. And again, we could have a nice long thread. So we started with about 1.20 meters. We probably don't need quite as much this time. About, let's say 80 centimeters or so would be fine. And I'm going to tie a knot in the end again. And this time I'm going to take the knot down on this side, because we're then going to bring this new thread up at the same position as we left the old thread. So the old thread here was just about to pass over this bar here, and the new thread is going to do the same thing. And we're then going to continue the weave with the new thread. So we haven't lost any of the pattern. And we're going to weave around there a few more times. Buttonhole pops look much nicer with plenty of weaving. If you worked, say, just 4 or 5 wraps around there, they look a little bit scrawny and spindly. So these are nice plump pops. We're going to buttonhole this now. It's very important that you start the buttonhole adjacent to the untwisted bar. Don't be confused by the old thread disappearing there. We don't want to cut that off yet because it's not thoroughly secure. It's only just sitting there. So we'll leave that for the moment, but don't let that be confused with this bar here. So we're going to start the buttonhole center adjacent to that untwisted bar. And we do that simply by dropping into the center hole and coming up through the working loop. So it's an ordinary simple buttonhole, sometimes known as a blanket stitch as well. And we're going to work clockwise around that disc. Tension is nice and firm, so these you can pull fairly nice and tight. Remember with buttonhole that a little wiggle from side to side is often a better way to tension than just dragging on the thread. It will tend to produce a neater finish. And I can feel now that the resistance on my whole filling is lovely and firm. That's what you're looking for. There is no need to work a certain number of buttonholes between each of the bars of your previous row. It won't help at all to count them. You just want a nice dense buttonhole all the way around the ring. So we're now going to work over that point where we brought in the new thread and the point where we cast out the old thread. and the buttonhole is going to trap those in beautifully. Make sure you're pulling away from centre all the time this time, and that will produce that lovely tension. So really nice and firm, and that good lot of about 15 circles of padding has given us that beautiful pudgy central pop. And there we go. So before we finish the filling, we're going to now get rid of our thread. So we take out the old thread and carefully, particularly if you were on a finer worked filling with a fine thread, we're going to clip that off. And then we're going to snip off the knot from the new thread to release its tail. I'm just going to bring it to the surface. I quite like to use these lace scissors for this sort of thing because you've got this bobble end that you can approach the work with rather than a point, and it just protects your work a little bit. Pull and clip at the same time so those ends sink back in nice and neatly. We're going to link the filling just by coming up through the head of the first buttonhole stitch, just to get that connected, and then that links the buttonhole and also allows it to sit nice and flat at that last stage. We're now going to complete the pattern. So we're going to work our way out to the outside edge now, and that's going to complete the filling. It's going to complete the twists on these 3 bars that currently have no twist on them, so it makes the pattern look more complete. And it's going to allow us to finish the thread on the outside edge rather than in the centre. So, a good thing to do to begin with, and this is nice and easy to see on these fillings in chunky thread, a good way to learn how to do it. If you look at your previous bar, you can see which direction the twists are going. So these are sloping in this direction. So that we know around this bar we've got to twist round this way. So we're going to pull that in that direction. So 1 over the top. So slipped under and came back over, and slip under again and come back over and back up to the other side. So that's given us 2 diagonal twists over the top of that bar to match those on this one here. It's worth, if you've got a little magnifier, having a look at that underneath that so you can see the direction of twist. If you did this twist the wrong way, it wouldn't be the end of the world, but it does help to make the pattern look more unified. Now, a lot of people would think at this point that you would weave over that corner, as in go over one and then under one. We're not going to do that. We're going to go over both threads there. Now, that's important because it allows this corner to close up. Notice I'm also pressing the needle on that point there just to encourage that bar to settle nice and neatly to the centre of this bar here, forming that nice clear T shape like the other bars do. So you're crossing over. It's sitting over this thread at the moment, and we're going to cross over both. And this time bring the needle up in this large space here. Give a nice little pull and a little settle. Okay, now we're going to work along this bar with the twist that we usually put as we were working round the wrapping stage. Once we'd finished the first row of twisted buttonholes, we wrapped round the ring. And we're going to complete that here. You remember we worked just 1 twist to get to centre, and so that we could pass out from that middle, that first bar. And we're now going to add the second twist to take us back to the edge. So we're going to twist round here again. Don't be concerned about this little corner opening up. That often happens. It wouldn't notice anywhere near as much in a fine thread, and it needs just what I've done there, which is a little bit of a settle with the needle to close it up. It's also a good idea, I find, to add an extra twist at this stage. In theory, we only need 1, but if you're finding that's opening up at all, an extra twist will solve that problem. We're then going to come across this corner. As I said, we don't weave at corners. We don't come over one thread and then under the other bar. You're going to cross over the corner. So over the bar thread and over this single thread here. So crossing over the corner and back up in this space here. And we're now going to twist around this one. So up on the right, down on the left, and back up again. A little bit of a pull and down, and drop to the back to finish. and that puts that final twist onto that thread to complete your pattern. And to finish your thread, we're going to do the same thing as we did right at the very, very beginning, which is to tuck the needle between the stitches. Try to do it at a slightly different point on your eyelet to you did for the first 2 stitches, just so that you're not building up bulk at any one point. And then bring the needle to the surface and pull and clip. We can then remove our pattern. And these patterns, of course, you can reuse many, many times. And finally, we're just going to clip off that starting tail. I'm just going to use my lace scissors, my bobble-ended scissors here, to go to the back and just clip that off. But if you feel safer, you could, of course, turn the frame over and clip that away. And there we've got our finished filling. And the tension should be lovely and taut. It's like a taut trampoline there. As I said, the getting the tension right, the spacing right, the accuracy of the pattern right takes practice, and it's really worth having a go at some of these fillings in this larger thread until you feel comfortable with the process. It's much harder when you go for the finer threads because they're more ethereal. They tend to float around in the air and grip to themselves. You've really got to be in control and know what you're doing. So working in this manner with the 12 perlé is a really good way to perfect the art. And you can imagine how you could then come up with all sorts of different patterns based on that process. So as we said, we could vary the pattern of the outer ring. We could do a group of 7 stitches, but very, very close together with no space. Then a single one, group of 7 close, then a single one, and so on around the circle. In the larger spaces, we could then put groups of 2 or 3 instead of one single one. We could just draw them together and finish in the center. We could just do the weaving in the center and pass out. Lots of possibilities. And there we go. They're quite addictive once you get going.